class, so we left off on this piece of architecture from chapter 11. So this is video lecture 2, chapter 11. If you haven't watched video lecture 1 for this chapter, please go and watch that first. But here we are looking at the prayer hall of the Great Mosque in Spain. And last time I showed you this picture of the Islamic Empire, and we're talking about this area right over here where it's located. And we were looking at a inside shot, floor plan of it, ground plan, as well as the outside. And we started talking about how it was laid out, that there's an outside courtyard here, the minaret, which is a place where they call to prayer the faithful. And we saw these on the Hagia Sophia from the time that it was a mosque. And there would be a crier that would call to prayer at certain times of the day for people who lived around there. The most important part of it is this prayer hall. And then the most important part of the prayer hall is this wall here. Now, it's important to know that this would have faced towards Mecca. And it was the mihrab, and then the niche found on the Qibla wall is through a horseshoe arch. We'll see it in a minute. But we just want to have a general layout of the building in mind before we start looking at it. Before that, I want to take a minute to look at the outside of it and see that, there's some amount of decoration on it, but overall, fairly plain. The entrance areas have more a relief decoration, but not a lot of it compared to some buildings and things we've looked at. This would be a detail above the door. So we're having the same type of geometric things that are vegetal patterning, interlocking. This is a common motifs, interlocking motifs, repetition of it. This is common in Islamic art from this era, and something that did affect other areas in their art forms as well. We'll see later. It had a great effect on it. I want to point out here we have small Corinthian columns. So again, we're seeing the continual influence of the Greeks, who influenced the world, as well as they influenced the Romans, who influenced the world as well. So we're getting these type of capitals on columns still hundreds of years later. So just want to point that out and see how people are taking design elements from other cultures and bringing them forward and really making them their own, I guess we could say. So as we go inside the prayer hall, this is coming in, looking out the courtyard. So we're talking about this area of the building. We're going to see that there's kind of an interesting thing going on here with horseshoe arches. This is associated with Islamic architecture, but the origin is Mesopotamia and the Visigoths as well. They have this type of arch. And there's this alternating pattern going on the top of them, red, white, on the visors of them at the entrance to the outside of the Qibla wall. That's what we're looking towards, actually, not the entrance, I'm sorry. And we'll see throughout here you have these Corinthian top columns. And a very interesting thing with the double arches. We haven't seen anything quite like this before. Really, really interesting. There's also a lot of arabesque patterning throughout this thing. That's the decorative patterns that we saw. And this galloping, they could call it too, overlapping arches. Pretty interesting designs. It kind of gives a rhythmic pattern to the whole inside of the place. If you think about all these columns going through and then you're seeing the repetition, it has very much a rhythmic feeling in the place. And we got that on the outside too in its own way with the geometric mathematical sort of style here. Interlocking foliage, tendrils of plants, surface decoration. You get a rhythmic, geometric feeling. And so that's kind of happening in a way here too, in the way that the arches are rhythmic and repeating, and the way the columns are as well. So I have pretty advanced mathematical geometric styles, and the inside of this has 400 columns. Now, these are an interesting way to expand the ceiling up to have stability in the architectural structure, and also to use columns from other places and adopt them and then make a double arch. So that's pretty interesting in the way they did that. The focal point of the prayer is here. This is that mirror of niche that we're going to start looking at. So on it, we have these really, really beautifully glazed tiles and details. And they're glazed mosaics as well. This is inside that Qibla wall, the most important part of that niche. And you see, beginning to see these really, 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 really intricate, geometric, interlocking, vegetal things like I've been talking about on the outside, but even more amazing with script and things like a feeling of all the flower pattern and repetition. Really beautiful, beautiful stuff. It's a portal for them that enables the worshippers. This is the idea that they have to, in a nutshell, enable worshippers to be spiritually transported to Mecca, which is the holiest site in Islam. So this is why it's the most important wall in the building, and because of that, it has a focal point. It has extra level of care and decoration to it, because this is where they're focusing their attention on, and they're doing it for a spiritual reason. And so that's reflected in the architecture and reflected in the decoration of the architecture. So if you look at it from that point of view, it makes a lot of sense why there would be extra level of care, more of these complex, interesting arches, a lot of different stuff happening here. Okay, we're going to talk a bit about what they would call the migration period, also known as the Dark Ages. It's a period that's sometimes also referred to as the barbarian invasion. What invasion of what? Well, we would say Rome, for one thing. And invasion of other parts of Europe from people who came from different areas coming into areas that they didn't originally have or own. So there's the peoples of the Huns coming in, the Goths coming in here, the Ostrogoths, and Vandals, Franks, Saxons, Visigoths. You have this whole area where the Vandals are coming through. And in some documentaries you see, and it's one that I would have showed, but I showed a bit of, but you can't really find a full version of it except for on Netflix, and I don't have a way of showing it to you, and I think it's also on Amazon Prime Video, is about the fact that these people who were invading Rome, they didn't necessarily want to destroy it as much, become a part of it, use the land, and sort of take on parts of their culture. So calling them barbarians might be a bit of a misnomer. Nonetheless, that's how history refers to them. So we'll continue on with that. And these movements became like profound changes within the Roman Empire and the so-called barbarian frontier. Like, that's why I'm calling so-called, because it depends upon how you interpret what that means, and there's a bit of so-called controversy. So we're making the transition from late antiquity to the early Middle Ages with this migration period. It could be divided into two phases. The first one, roughly 300 to 500 AD, and it was where Germanic peoples were in control of most of the areas of the former Western Roman Empire. Roman Britain was more slowly invaded and settled by like the Angles and the Saxons, That's where you get the idea of Anglo-Saxon people talk about. You've probably heard that phrase before. So we're going to look at some things that have to do with this territory, this area. And we haven't talked much about Britain since chapter 3, and we looked at Stonehenge and some different sites there. So we're going back to that part of the world a bit here for a second. And we're going to start in this chapter talking about different areas of Europe that have empires that are associated with this whole region and things like that too. So the Roman Britain was more slowly invaded and settled by the Anglo-Saxons. And Saxons are named after the sax, a distinctive knife popularly used by the tribe. This is the sort of style here. There's still actually kind of popular knife. If you ever watched the show Forged in Fire, it's a blacksmithing show. They have people make these, and I think in general they are still kind of a popular knife shape. But this is traditionally associated with this people group. They were a Germanic tribe that originally occupied the region which is today the north coast sea of Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. So we're talking about up to this area. And they spoke a West Germanic language that in the time would evolve over time into Old English, which is evolved into modern day English. They had a lot of influence on Western civilization, barbarian tribes did in general, and this way they did because of the language and the literature of this people group. Ends up the first epic poem in Old English, which is Beowulf, a prince who slays the monster. Interesting. Probably a lot of you may have read it in some point in school. They have a lot of people read it. And these countries had a big influence. These groups, I should say, had a big influence on the modern states of Europe. And eventually in England, we have this group, people, descendants of these groups, having a lot of influence because of the Magna Carta, which we'll talk more about later, in 1215, which was the first document since ancient Greece and Rome, which will limit the power of the king. And then also, here we go to this, Norse and Germanic mythology, which is shown in this interesting piece of art, a talisman with Odin and his two ravens. They had a lot of influence in this way, their Norse and Germanic mythology. So we had Greek mythology, we had Roman mythology. This is another type of mythology that has a lot of influence on things to come later. The Saxons were a literate people. Most of what we know about them comes from reports of a handful of writers, mostly bishops and monks, and also from archaeological research. So the artwork of these peoples during the migration period, we could go 300 AD circa to 900, so we're opening it up a bit here, includes the art of these Germanic tribes on the continent, as well as the start of the insular or Hiberno-Saxon art of the Celtic fusion with the British Isles. So kind of a lot of information there. But this kind of shows you how the intricate patterning is sometimes a bit difficult to decode, and there's an interlocking nature of it. But this is the face of Odin shown here, and there's these bird heads associated with him because he had ravens associated with him. Then there's pieces of animal sort of hooves or trails or markings, and then some masks on there. Another face mask with some small animal heads. So there's a lot of, and an open jawed beast up here sort of biting into something. So it has a lot of stuff going on it, but at first it looks like just a giant pattern. This style, the migration period art, is going to cover more than just this interlock, but it's going to cover things that use an influence of Byzantine, returning back to chapter 10, that empire. Enameling is influential to these types of art. And this is showing this glass inside of these little wells that are made by raising up the metal and then melted in place to give this beautiful color. And it's usually classified by regions and until eventually some international styles emerge in this chapter and the next one. So it's got a kind of named after things like insular, Celtic, Anglo-Saxon. You'll see different terms we'll use, but they're all basically kind of talking about versions of this migration period art. After Christianization, the migration period art developed into various schools as well of medieval art in Western Europe. And we'll get interesting things from different areas. But a lot of it you can see, maybe in some ways we can see a commonality with the Islamic art and their way of interlocking pattern, albeit the type of things like plant life they use and the feeling of it is very different. There's that sort of mathematical sort of feeling to it, or the very much interlocking overall pattern. The next piece we're going to look at is part of this, and it's actually from a ship burial in Suffolk, England. It's called the Sutton Hoo ship burial. It was an Anglo-Saxon burial. This is an idea, and one of the finest examples of migration period art we're going to look at. There was an idea here for these people that they would be, boats would carry them to the afterlife. And we're going to look at something that's called the purse cover. It was found in one of these ships, and it was on the belt around a waist of a corpse. So it was meant to be wearable. But if you think about a ship back then, you're like, okay, why bury him in a ship? It's meant to be the idea of a ship that takes you to the afterlife, but also prestige. So in this, you can see that they have a horse, different goods. This has been a common theme we found across a lot of cultures. You can think of maybe the Egyptians, right? We've got the Near East. We've got a lot of different places in the world doing this thing where they bury their dead with, and even like Etruscans, we had that in the early Greeks and the Aegean. Okay, a lot of people burying their dead with some type of items that are either important for the afterlife or show their power or wealth, or lots of variations of why exactly. Not exactly all the same reasoning, but doing this thing where they bury things worth quite a lot in their graves. Well, this is another version of that, so to speak. And it's important to realize with the ship burial that ships back then were not just, oh, okay, whatever, bury him in a ship. To have a ship was a power symbol. People who had ships were usually in charge of crews of people, had some kind of prestige. It wasn't just like, oh, well, it was whatever, I got a Pinto beater car, bury him in that. This is like burying them in the Mercedes-Benz Cadillac limousine war battleship type of thing here. Okay? This is a purse cover. By purse cover, we mean it would have been attached to a leather bag of some sort. And it's what we call animal style. So not your double at In-N-Out, haha, but your animal style. Why do you think that is? Well, pause for a moment to have you look at it. Because, of course, there's animals on it in the interlacing pattern. Okay? It's influenced by Scythian art. If you remember back in, where do I have it? Yes, here we go. Scythian art. If we remember back a number of chapters, we talked about this group of people who had this kind of interesting thing happening where one animal was turning into another. These are like bird-like forms and this geometry happening. And they were from the eastern steppes of Russia. We talked about this way back in chapter 4. And let's look at this a bit more in detail. We have on here in the middle an eagle swooping onto a duck. Okay? It's attacking it in the middle of the purse. Why would you do that? Why one bird attacking another? We've talked quite a bit about this before, and I think it's becoming more and more obvious and clear as we go along that these animal representations are power symbols, right? And a lot of times we've talked about how, oh, this is cheesy, whatever, they're old in time, way of thinking. We would never use such things. Well, think of a football team out of Philadelphia, right? Eagles. Think about a football team out of Chicago, Bears, right? Think about one down in the South of America, southern states of America, Ravens. You start to think more and more, you realize, okay, we use these type of symbols in our cultures all the time. The eagles associated with the United States. These are symbols that are still even being used today. So it's not as weird maybe as we might like to make it. Now, over here are front-facing guys, men, with on them are, let's see, jackals or creatures, fierce creatures, dog-like creatures. It's said to be different things by different people. And it's not exactly known, but the idea of the fierce creatures, dog-like looking creatures, to me they look like jackals or something like that, is the idea of strength and courage, blocking them off and being more powerful than them. It's a small scale art. It's made to be wearable and portable. And that was something that this had in common with the Scythian art. This was also small and portable. Why? Well, partially they probably lived very portable lives. They were moving around a bit. And they didn't necessarily want to make giant things. Okay, fine. That's one maybe possible interpretation or reason. The other one is, even now, people have all sorts of so-called bling, right? They wear diamond-encrusted watches, very nice purses, Gucci. You get the idea over and over. They want a special cell phone case. So people decorate themselves all the time and have items that are especially decorated as part of, status, right? This is all stuff, really nice sunglasses, you name it. All the things that people were doing back then, they're still doing today. There's still a way we can look at it and say, oh, it's not maybe quite so different. Okay. Moving on to another piece. Lion of St. John, Book of Durrow, illuminated manuscript from 600 AD. This word here, Durrow, Book of Durrow, that's a place, okay? This is probably the first major work of art that could be considered insular art of the British and Celtic style, okay? It's a style that was confined to Great Britain and Ireland and was the fusion of these Germanic traditions with the Celtic traditions via Irish monks. Ireland, interesting place because it escaped conquest by the Roman and Germanic tribes, and so it after sort of became Christian and was sort of in certain ways considered a haven of European scholarship. And there's even books about this idea, how the Irish saved civilization. You could get into further. We don't have time for all that. But this was seen in the late 7th century as well, and it would continue in Britain for about 150 years until the Viking invasion in the 9th century. After we see the emergence of it, it lasts much longer in Ireland up until the 12th century, which goes into chapter 12 for us. So Ireland continues on with this style for a long time. It's a religious page intro, an intro to a book, the Gospel of St. John. So the Lion of St. John, it's a book in the Bible, one of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it has the same sort of interlacing going on as we could see in this purse cover, right? Very intricate interlace. And what does this illuminated manuscript word mean? Well, it doesn't mean, you could say the idea illuminated means to be lit up, right? If you illuminate something, you light it. Well, they're lighting up the manuscript, which they mostly always did for really important books and primarily Bibles or parts of the Bible, gospel books, and things like that. So, because they care about the text and the words in it and the ideas, they feel that it requires and needs and they want it to have more decoration and something that makes it more prominent. The lion is quite abstract when we look at him here. It doesn't really feel very totally lionish. And there's a thing where he's in profile, his mouth is open with his teeth bared sort of in a growl or roar. And it has a flat repetition and a lot of color that feels very flat inside borders a lot of the time. It's in the Clisson style, which is a name for what I was telling you about here, where these wells of metal are made and then enamel is melted inside. It's called Clisson. It's the same thing happening here. It's spelled Cloisonne. So they're doing the same style, but in 2 dimensions, right? The lion is representative of St. John. So we'll look and see in other ones that each of the 4 evangelists, the writers of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, have a animal or some type of different symbols associated with them. So St. John and the lion are connected, and that's why he's put at the front of this. We'll look at this Book of Kells, which is another really, really elaborately illuminated manuscript of insular art. And one of the pages, which is called the Cairo Page from the Book of Kells, is an interesting page because there's a P and an X. Let me see if I can draw it for you. Not very well here, but I'll try with this free hand. How you would usually just show it in a very straightforward way is, okay, X and P. And we saw it on the shields from chapter 10 in the Justinian mosaics. And then if you overlay them, you kind of get a XP. Well, you can see it happening here. There's a very fancy X, and then you have it kind of turning into a P as well at the same time. It's more abstract going on, but you get the idea of it, right? So that's the first 2 letters of Christ's name in Greek, the X and the P. This has the 4 Gospels written in Latin, and it's illumination of the Word of God for them, so they believe it to be God's Word, so they're illuminating it very, very, very ornately. It's made from vellum, which is calf skins, with pigments of minerals, animal, vegetable abstract, and they use as their binder the egg white of a regular egg, the white part of it, the non-yolk part, which is a type of painting called tempera. Figures kind of emit out of the letters and shapes in this style, and you can kind of see a little bit of detail coming out. See here? There's a figure of a head coming out. This one has a lot of geometry in it. And it's pretty interesting because you kind of see here, let's go to the next slide. Hopefully it's on there. On this page, the trunk crucifix XPI page, that you get other type of figures, like dragonish looking figures coming out here. So it's interesting how things sort of are interlaced and coming out, and you have like animals mixed with these geometry all coming together in really, really beautiful patterns and color. It's called the trunk crucifixerant. You can see this is the T, and the word is, the name of it's coming from here, crucifixerant. The T of the trunk has 2 arms or letters going to like a fish, dragon, lion combination. Pretty interesting looking. close up here. So fish, dragon, lion type of shape going on. And this X over here, again, is the idea of Chi. The X is the beginning of Christ's name in Greek, and it also mimics a type of cross that you see sometimes referenced in certain other types of art, where there's the regular, I say regular, but the one we're most see cross, where you go, okay, well, there's another one that's like this that people use a lot of times. So it's also sort of referencing that at the same time. And it's kind of bringing forward the idea of Christ's role as Savior, because he's talked about and the cross is happening here. And we have these kind of power symbols, interesting people looking on over here. He's crucified between two thieves is the text this is coming from. And so you have almost like a witnessing of it by a grouping of people. Interesting where it came out of the text. It's talking about the crucifixion, so that's all kind of happening in this piece. And really, sometimes artistic, just total artistic interpretation by the monk probably the monk who did this, and adding the color and the interlace and the beautiful patterning to it. So I'm going to erase that and get on with here. Okay, so we can keep going on here for a little bit. We're going to move on to a whole different civilization, so to speak. Yeah, civilization, but really just they're related in the time period, and there's like crossover. It's not like a totally different era, but a different empire maybe is a better way of saying it, actually. It's the Carolingian Art and Empire. So it's happening at the same time, roughly, as the Islamic one we looked at. Chapter 10, this is the Byzantine Empire, while over here is the Carolingian Empire. Now, it's named after the Charles Martel is the first of them, the grandfather of Charlemagne, and Carolingian Empire is named after these guys, Charles Martel and his subsequent grandson, who was also the emperor. Did some pretty amazing things. Carolingian art comes out of that Frankish Empire. It comes in a period of roughly 120 years, from about 780 to 900, during the reign of Charlemagne and his immediate heirs, and it's popularly known as the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne means, it's like Carolingian, it means Charles, and this word right here, the main part of it, means great. So Charles the Great. He is really the one who's responsible for the Carolingian Renaissance, which includes things like standardizing writing. So words were separated by spaces and punctuation, and there were capitals at the beginning of sentences, not something that was happening before that. He promoted literacy. He built monasteries, and in a lot of ways, people would agree, historians would say, that he brought Europe out of the Dark Ages. He had a lot of influence. This is a sculpture of him by continental mission centers in his monasteries. And it appears that Byzantine artists resided in his areas and worked with his people to make things artistically in his empire. So there was some kind of collaboration, possibly from artists who were from the Byzantine area of the world. When he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III, and he was an emperor to them in their parlance and their ideas, like the Roman emperor, but a holy one. So we're talking about a Christian empire here. The Pope, leader of the Christian Roman Catholic Church, is crowning a king, and so we're dealing with the idea of an empire like an older one, a unified government in Western Europe out of the Dark Ages, allied with the Pope, And he held the borders between Spain and France, which we look at in those earlier slides, was a way for them to hold back the Islamic armies because they didn't want Islam to take over. As a symbolic representative of Rome, he sought a revival, renovatio, of Roman culture and learning in the West. And he needed an art that was capable of telling his stories effectively, which wasn't capable in the German migration period art. It didn't work for him. So he had a conscious desire to revive new art forms. And it was during his reign that Byzantine was having this iconoclasm controversy, which was dividing it all up. We talked about that in chapter 10. He supported the Western Church's refusal to follow iconoclasm. So there was a split up over that in the Byzantine Empire, like we talked about in chapter 10. So this is a picture of this guy. He said, no, we're not going to go with that. And he's not going to go along with the destruction of icons from 750 to 850 AD, which was a violent upheaval in the Eastern Mediterranean area. And he set out a position in his court to not have that idea, called the Libera Carolini. And he had no inhibitions about Mediterranean pagan idolatry like they were talking about there. So he introduced the first Christian monumental religious sculpture, and this was very, very much a momentous precedent for Western art. Charlemagne, here he is on top of a horse. So, very important figure in art history, but in the history of the world as well, for a lot of different reasons, helping Europe come out of the Dark Ages, everything I just said to you. So let's look at this statue. It's not super terribly huge. You can see it kind of in reference there. But it has a lot of things going on that are important. It's made out of bronze. It has traces of gilt, which is gold leaf or paint over parts of the bronze. It's traces because it's been worn over time. It is an equestrian statuette, not a full-blown size like the Marcus Aurelius statue, but it was based off that template of the equestrian statue from the Roman imperial period, right? We saw the first one that we said was going to be typologies of later ones. So we're getting the idea of Roman power coming through here. What does he have on him? Well, we have a crown, so another power symbol, but we also have a sword hidden in his cloak, and this orb right here. It's kind of interesting. He also would have originally had something in his hand here, maybe the actual sword, and this was just the scabbard. Or they've said possibly some other type of weapon. There's different things, but mostly people think it was the sword. It was made in 3 parts, and the rider and this body with the saddle, then the rider's head and the horse. So it's about 9.5 inches, not gigantic. And this orb of power in his hand. This is considered an orb of power, an imperial orb in his left hand. So in some way I kind of like to joke in my mind about this being like Sauron's rings of power or something. Why an orb? You know, this is a symbol of power for them. Like they had in other cultures scepters and other types of things. Well, this is one of those type of things. He has his riding cloak fastened with a fibula, which is a type of clasp that we'll see different pieces of. And that's a close-up of his face that looks like the gilt is coming off there. And we could say it's realistic, but not, it's naturalistic, I should say, but not realistic, right? It looks as a person, and it's not too far off, but it's not hyper-realism or something we believe to be fully him. But it has features on it that are particular to him. It's not just totally a random stylized guy. It feels like a particular person. It's often referred to as a statuette of Charlemagne, um, but it could have possibly been. This is a picture of Charlemagne, his his grandson or his grandfather, but we mostly believe it to be Charlemagne because there's coins depicting him, and there's a lot of commonality between the likenesses. If it was in some way kind of meant to look a little bit um, like his grandfather, then it would have been intentional to sort of talk about the connection between the lines. If it was Charlemagne's grandson I'm talking about, Charles the Bald, they think it might have been. If it was supposed to look kind of like Charlemagne, then they would be doing it purposefully to bring that connection together. And we could say that it's really interesting because of how it's connected to the Roman Empire, right? For me, this makes it more interesting because we're getting this idea coming through here where they're taking something and they're taking a typology all the way back from Rome and they're crowning him Holy Roman Emperor using things like the equestrian statue to continue on with this idea, but they're adapting it for their own purposes, right? They're making it their own, but continuing on with the theme um, and the kind of symbols of the power that they had in various places. So it's pretty interesting statuette, and it's interesting because it's bronze, and in some way, when you see it, you feel as if you may be looking at, someone who was alive thousands of years ago almost, 870, that's a long time ago. You're looking in the face of someone who was powerful in the world that long ago, but it does feel like a particular person. So that's very interesting to me. We're going to look at the Palace of Chapel of Charlemagne in Aachen, Germany. It's from the medieval Carolingian period, 800 AD. The architect of this place was Otto Metz. This is a drawing of it. He was an architect who lived during Charlemagne's reign and in the Carolingian Empire, obviously. He was probably earliest known architect born north of the Alps, and he was possibly Armenian. His interesting chapel plan that we're going to look at in elaborate elevations of building are reminiscent of the central plan church of San Vitale we saw in Ravenna. We've referenced this a few times, and it's an important building in that regard because of the central plan. If you remember, that was made by Justinian in Italy. Chapter 10, that's what we're talking about. It's not known whether he saw this building, or if he just had only seen drawings of them, but he had a large amount of technical knowledge from a book called The Architecture by Vitruvius. And many Carolingian Renaissance era manuscripts of Vitruvius's work existed, so he was well read in that regard. The function of this is this area over here, attached to the palace, was to be an actual place of worship attached to his palace, Charlemagne's palace, in his capital city in Germany. Okay, this is a floor plan and a cutaway of it here. Architectural model. It had round arches in it and a dome upon it. Really, really quite beautiful. It's been added to over the years. This is a much more current picture of it. And this is the inside, looking in here, going inside of it. It had a marble throne on the second story, and you can see inside here really Corinthian columns. Again, Roman influence, Greek influence throughout the world of art and architecture. And we see that it has a lot of a dome in it, right? We went back to the dome. That's an archway symbol of a connection point to the heavens, right? We've talked about this with other buildings, like the Pantheon, even going back to Greek to Roman architecture, I should say. We've talked about how domes are often associated with the heavens, the sky above, and so we have that type of of a reference going on here. And there's a lot of circles throughout it, and archways, which again are that kind of feeling, circular archways going through a space connected to eternity, and light usually being associated with symbol for God's presence. We have a giant light source there. This is a picture of that dome of the throne area that was on the second floor. So I want to point out the idea of the fact that someone would put inside of their chapel, right, a place of religious worship, a throne. This is very, very interesting because it's a royal court in a sense too. To have a throne, you'd have the royal court. The people who were your lords and barons, etc., would come there and be part of the worship service. And in a way, putting it on the second floor says, okay, we're not the main event. There's something else below. But it's a very strong symbol when you think about the fact that he's being called Holy Roman Emperor, right? We see also in this, I want to point out, this picture shows a little better, or maybe this one, that there's this influence from the Islamic prayer hall that we saw. The black and white back and forth patterning on the arches. And there's marble floors inside of it and marble on some of the columns. Gold mosaics that have Byzantine influence. So there's different things throughout this that are showing the influence of Rome and different parts of architecture throughout the art history in the world here. Really, in a way, you could say he's really trying to establish himself as the heir of the great rulers of the past, to emulate and symbolically connect himself to the early artistic achievements of early Christian Byzantine culture and the Roman Empire with his own culture, his own artistic achievement. So they were conscious of the fact that they lacked an artistic style to, bring this about. So they were really making their own style. They were inventing it here when they were early on, and we're talking about barbarian art. They're trying to unify Western Europe, and so they're really trying to create a style of art that could be large-scale architecture, and things were changing in the world because of the unification of Europe. There was more peace and prosperity, the settling down of battling and fighting and things. They could begin to do this type of large-scale architecture again and pick up with so-called peace and prosperity and be able to do these things that were symbols in that way. So architecture is very powerful in this symbolic way. And to pull off this type of building, you have to have a lot of resources, people to work on it, money, ability to find this type of stone, and the craftsmen and artisans to be able to do it. So it really requires really a lot of power to pull off these type of building projects. And people back then would know that, and so it would be part of why you would do it. Now, we're going to look at St. Matthew from the Igbo Gospels, an illuminated manuscript from this era. It's the art of book decoration, illuminated manuscripts. They're hand decorated and made, and they reached their highest form in the Dark Ages in Ireland, but other people in other parts of the world, like the Carolingian Empire, also did it. They're very decorative and rich because they believed the Bible to hold, God's truth, so they wanted to illuminate it. This show illuminated, not laminated, illuminated. So this shows kind of the position of a scribe who would be illuminating a manuscript. If you also think about this era, we're talking about a era before Gutenberg's printing press, which was about 1450, 1452. So we're talking years and years and years before that, right? 600 some odd years. So at this point, any book is copied by hand. Books are rare and expensive to have, and really only the wealthy have them. Literacy is not high. So these kind of manuscripts were produced largely by monks, clerics, and a few workshops around the empire. And they each kind of had their own style based on the artists and influences that they were paying attention to. So this is very interesting book cover here. It's a gospel cover for the Lindau Gospels, which is the Gospels religious text. Illuminated manuscript, a codex. It's a form of book we have, kind of an early form of the book we have today, from 800 AD. This piece is, but from around 300 to 400 AD, they began to do bind pages. In this part of the world, usually vellum, which is calfskin. This is a luxurious book cover. I mean, we're talking about the front cover of a work that that's a gospel work made out of gold and jewels, right? It was really, really, really. This is really, 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 really would be very expensive to make. You think about all these jewels, the amount of gold here. On the cover we have Christ being crucified. There's nails in his hands. He has this sort of halo form over his head. We have in various parts over here big ornamentation of jewels all around it. It's pretty amazing ornation going on here. It's only one of only a few of these covers to have survived, because a lot of them were broken down and taken into other things because of the value of all these jewels and this gold. They're called treasure bindings, and it's innate covers in precious metal with jewels set around. And a lot of times some of them even have like ivory carving in the middle of the panels. This is the lower or back cover of it, and it was of the same gospel, but it was probably the cover of another older book originally, and they took it off and used it for this one. This is pretty common as well to do this, to take things off of other books and use them, like especially these treasure bindings. This one was probably from a earlier insular work like the Book of Kells, and one of the only ones to survive from that era because it was taken and used as the back cover for this gospel. We know books like the Book of Kells had them, but they're not there any longer. So we're talking about pure luxury here. We could think about treasure bindings in a certain way to be this idea in real base form is that the work inside the written work, in this case a gospel or gospels, for them is treasure. They believe it is very valuable, and so to show their due respect for it, they want to give a treasure binding to it. So if you think about it that way, it starts to make a bit more sense why they would spend so much wealth on it. If they had a lot of wealth to use it that way would make sense. So we're going to start talking about the Attonian Empire. Attonian art is a continuation in certain ways, a continued Holy Roman Empire, we should say. So we're going to look at the Attonian dynasty was a Saxon dynasty of German monarchs named after three of its kings. The Holy Roman emperors named Otto is Otto the First, which ruled Germany, northern Italy between 919 and 1024. Henry the First, Otto the First, Otto the Second, Otto the Third, and Henry the Second. So those are the main guys. When the Carolingian Empire began to implode in the 9th century, local aristocrats seized power, and they were opportunistic. This was kind of a process known as the de-evolution of power. But the Holy Roman Empire was reestablished under this Attonian dynasty. The traditional lineage of art kind of goes Attonian follows Carolingian, and then Carolingian These ones proceed Romanesque, and then it carries on into the next chapters. So this is a pre-Romanesque Germanic art. In a nutshell, we could say that this style didn't end or neatly coincide with exactly ending and starting. There's overlap in certain ways. It didn't exactly end with the rule of the dynasty. These kind of art forms emerged in areas, and they were kind of specific to a few small cities and periods. They weren't international styles, and we don't see an international style happening until our next chapters that we look at. Much of the art we'll look at is really very, very much Christian in its themes, and there was an idea of a renewal of faith that they were trying to show in their art and reforming the church and creating a period of heightened cultural and artistic fever in the Etonian artists in their sort of dynasty empire here. So some things that were important for this era, and the reason why some of the art was made was because of a wider display to the public, especially pilgrims. And if you remember, we talked earlier about pilgrimage being a journey taken for a religious reason. So people would often go to places where there were important relics. And relics would be, like we talked about before, a piece of something from a holy person, maybe clothing, finger bones, and a reliquary that would hold the relic, which was very ornate usually. And they would often go on these trips to as penance to atone for sin, and then also because they were devoted, that would be another reason. And because of that, there was a network of routes and monasteries people would stay in. We talked about the monastic movement earlier. We're going to look at one of these maybe so-called things that would be displayed or was also beautiful, another gospel cover from this era. It's called the cover of the Gospel of Otto III. In the middle of it is ivory panel, and it's got golden jewels on the outside of it. And we see here, like the last one, but maybe more detailed about around the narrative, is Christ crucified and he's died, and the Roman soldier piercing his side with a spear. And then on this side is the offer of wine vinegar before he says it is finished in the gospel account. So very much referencing the last part of the life of Christ when he was crucified. This style, they sought to emulate the Eastern Romans empires like the Byzantine grandeur in their work. And so we'll see some of that kind of icon-like quality of the Byzantine styles in some of this. It's strongly influenced by Byzantine art, okay? This is a piece that was inside of the gospel, and it's showing female personification, so a person representing a larger idea or group. Germany, Gaul, and Rome bringing gifts to Otto III. And it's inside the gospel, his gospel book. He didn't rewrite the gospel, but he had it made. He had the cover made, he had it illuminated, and this is part of it. So this is him enthroned in his own decorated gospel, illuminated gospel. Pretty intense symbolism here, right? I can't find a lot of good images of the pages side by side. But this is the personifications. Here he is enthroned. And he's made people who represent countries bringing him gifts, which means what? He's in charge. He's in power. He's being lauded as the awesome, awesome, awesome guy. It's a style of illustration that's definitely influenced by Byzantine art. We can see the purple from Justinian, right? And the way he's looking. He has an orb in his hand, power symbol like Charlemagne, and some sort of staff here as well. A scepter. He's got on one side the church, on the other side the military. Where do we see this last? Justinian's mosaic, right? Remember that? He has military might and church might with him in the middle inside of this really, really, really ornately decorated church. Well, this guy, he's doing the same thing here, and he's doing it inside of a gospel book. This is very, very, very much, about establishing himself as the worthy successor to Charlemagne and the Byzantine Empire and the Roman Empire, right? This is a page from his gospel, Christ washing the apostles' feet. So it wasn't just, the cover jeweled and a page that was illuminated with him, but there were other parts of the narrative that were also illustrated slash, illumination. So he's washing their feet. This is interesting because in the narrative here, he is a servant to his disciples and he's washing their feet. And Peter says, "No, don't wash my feet. I should wash yours." And he says, "If I don't wash your feet, then you have no part in me." So he says, "Wash my feet and my head as well." Well, it's very much about Christ being represented as savior, server of humanity. But we have interesting things going on here because there's a lot of ornamentation. He's got this halo over his head. He's holy. He's God. There's gold all around him for them. This is their belief. This is why they're depicting it this way. And he's very, very much like an icon from the Byzantine Empire, right? You can see a lot of commonalities in that. Very much referencing that effect, the grandeur of the Eastern Roman Empire. It's kind of a really beautifully decorated thing. It's not hyper realistic, but it's got naturalism to it. There's an attempt at some kind of shading, but it's very stylized with the way the cloth is falling and the groupings of the people. It's not going for realism. It's very much more stylization here. So before we end chapter 11, I want to talk for a moment about Greek and Roman idealism. This is shown in the spear bearer, and kind of compare it to the medieval art, the human figure in medieval art. There's a heroic humanistic beauty that they're trying to capture in the men and women of the Greek and Roman idealism, and anatomical accuracy is very much a part of that. But here in this reference to humanity, Christ, and also all the people, the depiction of humanity is very different. There's not a lot of sculpture to compare it to up until Charlemagne, but always we have in these art forms that there's never nudity. They're mostly clothed fully. There's not a focus on anatomical accuracy here. Okay, there's way more of a focus upon the story and making things conceptually understood. The body for these people was in need of washing and redemption, so they're not showing it in sort of a heroic quality for the sake of humanism over here. We're talking about a big philosophical difference between them. So not a lot of sculpture, fully clothed, not focused on anatomical accuracy or physical beauty for its own sake, but focusing on the body as something that needs to be redeemed in there. That's their psychological bent and thought and concept. So they're showing stories, narratives. They're showing things that are different, and they're using symbols of power in a different way and conceptually. Whereas over here, there's like an idea of a societal ideal to achieve in a humanism. This is their worldview, much different worldview. So I just want to kind of compare and contrast that as a theme that we'll keep looking at. All right, guys, that takes us through chapter 11. So I hope things are kind of coming together, making sense, and you're seeing large themes over the course of over the course of the book's chapters and as we develop and go through different styles in this survey. So take care out there, stay safe, and make sure you're practicing good hand washing and everything. All right, I have the date for the test for chapters 10, 8, 9, and 10. There's already one scheduled. You need to look in the module for that. And then we're starting on the next section, which would be a test for chapters 11, 12, and 13, which will be the finals week. And I posted a slide list, a vocabulary slide list in this module, chapter 11 module. So you're going to want to look at that. Spend the time to look up those terms in your book, research them from the lectures, and really define them. I don't make you write the sentences about them and fill it in, but I strongly suggest, and that's part of the time you're meant to be spending in classes, to do that by looking in your book, finding the definitions, compiling them, and writing them in one spot, and really understanding them and looking over those images to memorize what they look like and the details of them, so you can effectively take your tests and understand this stuff. Okay? So take care. Hope you're doing well out there.